The enemy commander pressed the muzzle of his pistol against the temple of a bleeding American soldier, and somewhere above the valley, a woman nobody could see was already exhaling the breath she needed to kill him. That single moment, one trigger pull deciding whether 8 Navy SEALs lived or died in a stone compound surrounded by 30 hostile fighters, is where this story truly begins. Before we get there, if stories like this keep you glued to the screen, hit subscribe and stay with me until the very end. And I'd love to know. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight, so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Lieutenant Commander Ethan Walker checked his watch for the 3rd time in 2 minutes, though he already knew what it would say. 0214. 3 minutes until they moved. 3 minutes until 7 other men trusted their lives to intelligence that had been wrong before and could be wrong again. He crouched behind a low stone wall on the outskirts of the village, night vision painting the world in grainy green, and looked down the line at his team. Chief Petty Officer Sam Okafor was checking his rifle for the 5th time, a habit Walker had learned to read as nerves rather than negligence. Petty Officer Tyler Brooks had his head tilted, listening to something only he could hear: dogs maybe, or the absence of them, which in a village this size was its own kind of warning. Diego Ramirez was watching the rooftops. Jake Sullivan, the youngest of them at 23, was watching Walker. The way young operators always watch their commander in the seconds before a breach, looking for some sign that everything was fine. Walker gave him a nod. It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie a leader owed his team in the dark. "Command, this is Reaper 1, Walker said into his radio voice, pitched low. "In position. Confirm Overwatch has eyes on target structure." The response crackled back, thin and distant. "Reaper 1, Overwatch confirms. Single structure, minimal security presence. You are clear to proceed." Minimal security presence. Walker had heard those words in the mission brief 6 hours earlier, delivered with the flat confidence of an intelligence officer who wasn't the one about to walk through a door in the dark. He didn't like them then. He liked them less now, with the hair on the back of his neck standing up for no reason he could name. "Copy Overwatch," he said. "Reaper 1 moving." He raised his hand, 3 fingers, folding down one at a time, the silent countdown his team had run 100 times in training and a dozen times for real. 3, 2, 1, they moved. The plan was simple, the kind of simple that always sounded good on paper. Breach the compound where the high-value target was reportedly sleeping, secure him before he could raise an alarm, extract to the landing zone, 400 meters east. In and out in under 10 minutes. Walker had run harder missions with worse odds. He tried to hold on to that thought as his boots carried him silently across broken ground toward the compound's outer wall. They made it 30 meters. That was as far as the plan survived. The first shot came from a rooftop that intelligence had marked as unoccupied, a single crack that sounded almost polite before it turned into an avalanche. Muzzle flashes bloomed from windows that should have been empty, from a grain silo that should have held nothing but grain, from behind a low wall that Walker himself had walked past 30 seconds earlier without a second glance. Contact left multiple positions." Okafor's voice cut through the radio, already moving from alarm into the flat professional register that kept men alive. Walker's whole world compressed into the next 4 seconds. He saw Ramirez drop to a knee and return fire toward the silo. He saw Brooks grab Sullivan by the vest and haul him behind a stone trough as rounds chewed the dirt where the kid had been standing. He heard the distinct ugly sound of a round finding flesh instead of stone, and someone screamed. He didn't know who yet. There wasn't time to know who, and the night that had been theirs 30 seconds ago now belonged entirely to the enemy. "Fall back to the compound." "Fall back," Walker roared, because the compound at least had walls, and walls were something. "Coleman Alvarez, get eyes on that scream. Sullivan's hit, he's still moving." That was Brooks dragging the younger man by his vest through a gap in the wall, while Ramirez and Okafor laid down, covering fire in short, disciplined bursts. Walker counted heads as they poured through a broken gate into the compound's central courtyard. 7. Then, Petty Officer Nate Coleman came through, last blood already soaking through the sleeve of his uniform, cursing in a way that told Walker the wound wasn't fatal. A man screaming that fluently still had plenty of fight left in him. 8. All 8 of them inside 4 crumbling stone walls with an enemy force that intelligence had called minimal, now ringing them from every direction like wolves closing on a fire. "Sound off injuries," Walker shouted, dropping behind a low wall as rounds sparked off the stone above his head. Sullivan's hit shoulder. He's conscious. Doc Alvarez called back, already working hands moving with the brutal efficiency of a man who'd done this too many times to let his own fear slow him down. "Coleman's grazed. I'm fine, I'm still up." Coleman snapped, already reloading. "That's 2, Walker said, doing the math that every commander did in the worst moments of his career, the math that never got easier, no matter how many times he'd run it. 2 wounded, 6 still fully combat effective. Against, he risked a look over the wall, and immediately dropped back down as 3 rounds cracked past where his head had just been, against more men than he could count in the dark, moving with the coordination of a force that had been waiting for them, not surprised by them. "This wasn't minimal security," Ramirez said, voice tight, reloading his weapon with hands that were almost steady. "Sir, this was a trap." Walker didn't answer because there was nothing to say that Ramirez didn't already know. He keyed his radio instead. "Overwatch, this is Reaper 1. We are engaged. I say again, we are engaged with a hostile force far exceeding briefed numbers, requesting immediate sitrep on enemy positions and status of extraction." Static answered him. He tried again, forcing his voice to stay level, even as a round punched through the wooden gate 6 feet from his position. "Overwatch, Reaper 1, do you copy?" Nothing. Not even the thin, distant hum of an open channel. Just silence, where a voice was supposed to be, and in that silence, Walker felt something cold settle into his chest that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Command, this is Reaper 1. He tried instead, switching frequencies. "We have lost contact with Overwatch. Requesting status." The response, when it finally came, wasn't the answer he wanted. "Reaper 1, be advised, we are also unable to raise Overwatch. Working the problem. Extraction bird is wheels up ETA 25 minutes. 25 minutes. Walker looked around the courtyard at his team, 6 men firing in disciplined rotation to conserve ammunition. 2 men wounded and getting worse, walls that were slowly being chipped apart by sustained fire, and an enemy force that showed no sign of running low on anything. 25 minutes might as well have been 25 hours. "Sir." Brooks's voice had an edge to it Walker hadn't heard from the man in 3 deployments together. "Sir, they're maneuvering on the east wall. I count at least a dozen moving to flank." Walker crawled to Brooks's position, risked a glance, and felt his stomach drop. Brooks was right. Shapes were moving through the darkness beyond the east wall, spreading out with the patient discipline of trained fighters, not the chaotic swarm of local militia. Whoever these men were, somebody had trained them well, and somebody had known exactly where 8 American operators would be standing tonight. "Where's our Overwatch?" Walker said more to himself than to anyone, because Overwatch was supposed to see this coming. Overwatch was supposed to be the eyes that kept them alive when their own eyes couldn't cover every angle at once. Overwatch had gone silent at the exact moment they needed her most, and that couldn't be coincidence. That thought alone was enough to make his hands tighten on his rifle, high above them in a position she had chosen hours earlier. For exactly this kind of night, Staff Sergeant Olivia Hayes lay motionless behind a jagged outcrop of rock, her rifle trained on the compound below. Her mind screaming at her to do something, while her training screamed just as loudly that she couldn't. Beside her, Sergeant Marcus Reed lay very still, and not by choice. "Marcus!" Olivia's voice was barely a breath, her eyes never leaving her scope. "Marcus, stay with me." He didn't answer. The enemy sniper's round had caught him 20 minutes earlier in the opening seconds of the ambush, before Olivia even understood what was happening below. One moment he'd been beside her, calling wind speed and range with the same steady voice he'd used on 11 deployments together. The next moment he was on the ground, blood spreading dark across the rock, and Olivia was alone with a rifle, a radio that wouldn't transmit, and 8 men below who had no idea their guardian angel had already been shot out of the sky. She'd tried to warn them. God, she'd tried. The moment she'd spotted the first fighters moving into position along the rooftops, men who weren't supposed to be there, men in numbers that shattered every briefing she'd been given, she'd keyed her radio and screamed a warning into the night. Reaper 1, this is Overwatch. You are walking into an ambush. I say again, ambush, abort, abort. But the enemy sniper had found her exact position in the same instant, and the round that took Marcus down had also shattered something in her radio pack, and every word she'd screamed after that had gone nowhere but into the dark, unheard useless. While below her, the mission she'd tried to save collapsed exactly the way she'd feared it would. Now she watched through her scope as 8 men she had never met huddled behind crumbling stone walls, fighting for their lives against an enemy that outnumbered them nearly 4-1. She watched a young soldier get dragged to cover with blood soaking his shoulder. She watched a commander try his radio again and again, unaware that the voice he was calling for was lying 20 feet away with a bullet in her equipment and a promise she couldn't keep. Her orders were absolute, drilled into her since the day she'd earned this position. Observe, report, do not engage unless the Overwatch position itself was directly threatened. A sniper's value was in patience, in invisibility, in being the eyes nobody knew were watching. The moment she fired a shot, she stopped being invisible. The moment she fired a shot, every enemy fighter in that valley would turn their attention toward the ridge, toward her, toward the one position that was supposed to remain a secret until the mission's end. You engage, they will triangulate your position in under 60 seconds. Marcus had told her once months ago during a training exercise that felt like a lifetime away right now. And once they know where you are, you're not Overwatch anymore. You're a target with one gun against everyone who wants you dead. She understood the math. She had understood it every day of her career, but the math had never before asked her to watch 8 men die while she had the power to stop it. Below, the situation was deteriorating with every passing second. Walker's voice reached her faintly on the wind, shouting orders, and through her scope, she watched him press a hand to Coleman's bleeding arm before shoving the man back toward cover. Watched Alvarez working over Sullivan with quick, desperate hands. Watched Ramirez firing in short bursts to conserve rounds that were clearly running low. Then she saw the machine gun position. 2 enemy fighters were dragging a heavy weapon up onto a rooftop overlooking the compound's south wall. The wall with the thinnest cover, the wall closest to where 3 of the SEALs were currently positioned. Olivia had seen enough combat to know exactly what that weapon would do once it was in place. It wouldn't just kill. It would end the fight in under a minute, cutting through stone and men alike with equal indifference. Her finger found the trigger guard resting there without pressing further, her whole body caught in the space between training and instinct. Report. She whispered to herself the word Marcus would have said if he could still speak. Just report it, that's the job. But there was no one to report to. Her radio was dead. Her spotter was silent beside her. And in less than 30 seconds, that machine gun would open fire on men who had no idea it existed. Below, unaware of the weapon rising above them, Walker made a decision of his own, one born of desperation rather than doctrine. Ramirez Okafor on me, he said, voice low and urgent. We're going to push the north gate, draw their attention away from the wounded, buy Doc more time to stabilize Sullivan. Sir, that's exposed ground. We'll be cut to pieces. We stay here, we die slower. That's the only difference, Walker snapped. Move. It was the kind of order that came from a commander who had run out of good options and was choosing between bad ones, and every man in that courtyard knew it, and every man moved anyway, because that was what 8 years of training and trust bought you men who followed orders they knew might kill them, because the alternative was letting their brothers die instead. Above, Olivia watched the 2 SEALs rise from cover behind Walker. Watched them begin to move across open ground toward the north gate. Watched the machine gun crew on the rooftop swing their weapon. Not toward the north gate at all, but toward the exposed backs of the very men who thought they were creating a diversion. They didn't know. They couldn't know. From their position in the courtyard, the rooftop with the machine gun was a blind spot, hidden by the angle of the compound's own walls. Olivia was the only person in that entire valley who could see what was about to happen, and the only person who could stop it. A weapon is not defined by how accurately it hits. Her father's voice rose up from some buried place in her memory, the same words he'd told her the very first time he placed a rifle in her hands as a teenager on their family's back 40 acres. It is defined by why you choose to use it. She thought of Marcus beside her silent bleeding, trusting her even now to make the call he couldn't make for her. She thought of 8 men below who had no idea a woman on a ridge had already broken every rule in her training manual before she ever pulled the trigger, simply by choosing in this moment that their lives mattered more than her own exposure. Olivia exhaled slow and controlled the way she had 10,000 times before. And she fired. The round crossed 412 meters of mountain air in under half a second, and one of the 2 men on the rooftop machine gun position dropped without ever knowing what killed him. The weapon he'd been bracing swung wildly as his partner scrambled panicked, trying to understand where the shot had come from, and Olivia's second round answered that question for him permanently. In the courtyard below, Walker froze mid-stride at the sound of 2 rifle cracks from somewhere impossibly far away. Cracks that didn't match the AK fire surrounding them, cracks that came from a weapon he recognized instantly because he'd carried one just like it 100 times himself. "Report!" he shouted, spinning toward his men. "Report who's firing where." "That wasn't us, sir," Ramirez called back, just as confused, ducking back toward cover with Okafor. "That came from the ridge." Above them on the rooftop that had been about to unleash devastation on their exposed position, 2 enemy fighters lay dead beside a machine gun that would never fire a single round. Walker stared up into the darkness of the mountain, his mind racing through possibilities that all felt equally impossible. Overwatch was dead, or captured. That was the assumption they'd been operating under for the last 10 minutes of silence on the radio. But someone up there had just saved 3 of his men from a weapon they never even saw coming. "Overwatch." He tried the radio again, voice half hopeful, half disbelieving. "Overwatch, is that you? Do you copy? Static." No answer came because Olivia's radio was still shattered, still useless, and all she could do was watch through her scope as the men below stared up at the mountain in confusion, unaware that the woman who had just saved their lives had no way to tell them she was still fighting for them. But she wasn't finished. Because even as Walker and his men processed the impossible gift of those 2 rifle shots, the enemy below was already reacting, already understanding that a threat existed on the ridge that hadn't been accounted for. Shouts rose in a language Olivia didn't speak but understood perfectly by tone. Alone confusion, then alarm, then the beginning of a hunt. "They know," Olivia whispered more to Marcus's still form than to herself. "They know I'm here now." She had broken cover. She had traded invisibility for 2 lives, and now every fighter in that valley would turn their attention toward finding the person who had just killed 2 of their own from a position they couldn't see. Through her scope, she watched the enemy commander step into view. For the first time, a tall man in dark clothing moving through the chaos with the calm authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, shouting orders that sent fighters scrambling in new directions, some toward the ridge, most still tightening the noose around the compound below. He was close enough now that Olivia could have taken the shot. Right there could have ended this with a single round, the way she'd already ended 2 threats in the last 90 seconds. But something in the way he moved, the way fighters immediately fell into new formations at his command, told her this man was worth more information than he was worth as an immediate kill. If she took him now, someone else would simply take his place, and she'd have revealed her exact position for nothing but a temporary disruption. She was wrong about that hesitation costing her nothing. Because in the next 90 seconds, that same commander would make a decision that would force her hand completely, that would strip away every remaining shred of doctrine and training and leave her with only one choice. The choice her father had told her mattered more than any shot she'd ever take. Below inside the compound, Doc Alvarez was losing the fight to keep Sullivan stable. The young soldier's face had gone pale, his breathing shallow and fast, blood loss, finally catching up to adrenaline in the way it always eventually did. "He needs real medical attention now," Alvarez said, voice tight with the particular fear of a medic who knew exactly how close his patient was to slipping away. "I've done what I can out here, sir, but he needs a hospital, not a compound wall." "Chopper's 20 minutes out," Walker said, and even as the words left his mouth, he heard how useless they sounded against the reality in front of him. He might not have 20 minutes. Walker looked down at Sullivan, 23 years old, engaged to be married in 4 months. A kid who'd told Walker on the flight in that this deployment was supposed to be his last, before he went home to build a life with a woman named Grace, who was probably asleep right now on the other side of the world. No idea her fiancé was bleeding out on a mountainside because an intelligence report had been catastrophically wrong. "He's not dying tonight," Walker said, low and fierce, more promise than prediction. "Not on my watch." That was when the enemy commander made his move. He'd found something or someone. Olivia watched through her scope as fighters dragged a figure from somewhere beyond her sightline, someone she hadn't accounted for, someone in what looked like local civilian clothing, but moving with a bound, stumbling gait that told her clearly enough this was a captive, not a combatant. The commander pressed a pistol to the captive's head and shouted something toward the compound, his voice carrying clearly enough across the night that even Walker, 400 meters away and separated by stone walls, could catch the tone, if not the words. It didn't take a translator to understand what was happening. It was theater cruelty, a strategy, an attempt to shatter the resolve of trapped men by showing them exactly what kind of enemy they were facing. "Sir," Okafor said quietly, watching through a gap in the wall. "He's got a hostage. Looks local, might be an informant, might be someone who helped guide us in. Either way, he's about to execute him in front of us." Walker's jaw tightened. There was nothing his team could do from their position, too many fighters between them and the commander. Any attempt to intervene would only add another body to a night that already had far too many. But 400 meters up the mountain, Olivia Hayes was not 400 meters too far away at all. She sighted the commander through her scope, watched his finger tighten on the trigger of the pistol pressed against an innocent man's skull, and felt every ounce of doctrine, every rule about patience and invisibility and observe, don't engage, burn away into something far simpler and far more absolute. "Not tonight," she breathed. Her finger found the trigger. Below her, unaware that the woman who had already saved 3 lives tonight was about to attempt the shot of her career, Walker watched in helpless horror as the commander's arm tensed for the kill. And somewhere in the space between one heartbeat and the next, a single rifle shot cracked across the valley, louder, closer, more final than anything that had come before it. And the enemy commander, who had been seconds from ending an innocent life, crumpled to the ground without ever pulling his own trigger. For a moment, the entire battlefield seemed to hold its breath. Fighters who had been moving with coordinated purpose froze confused, searching the darkness for a threat they still couldn't locate. The hostage, suddenly free of the pistol's pressure, dropped to his knees alive, stunned, uncomprehending of the mercy that had just saved him. And in the compound below, 8 exhausted, wounded, cornered American operators stared up into the black silhouette of the mountain, finally understanding that somewhere up there, someone had been watching over them the entire night, someone who had gone silent. Not because she'd abandoned them, but because she'd already been fighting a battle of her own, alone against odds that should have made saving anyone impossible. "Command," Walker said into his radio voice, raw with something between disbelief and desperate hope. "This is Reaper 1. Be advised, we have a friendly sniper engaging hostiles from an elevated position. I don't know who she is. I don't know how she's still fighting. But she just saved a man's life from 400 meters out, and she's the only reason my team isn't dead yet." Above him, hidden among the rocks, Olivia Hayes chambered another round, glanced once at Marcus's still silent form beside her, and understood with absolute clarity that the hardest part of this night was not yet behind her. Because now, every enemy fighter in that valley knew exactly where the second shot had come from, and they were already turning toward the ridge. The valley didn't go quiet. It went hunting. Olivia felt it before she understood it, a shift in the rhythm of gunfire below the frantic, undisciplined chatter of men who'd lost their target, replaced by something colder, more coordinated. Voices barked orders in short-clipped bursts. Flashlight beams began sweeping the rock face in wide, searching arcs. Somewhere in the dark, a man was shouting the same phrase over and over, and even without knowing the language, Olivia understood its meaning perfectly. "Find her." "They think there's more than one of us," she whispered to Marcus, though he couldn't answer, though his chest was rising and falling in shallow, uneven pulls that scared her more than any gunfire ever could. 2 shots, 2 different angles. They can't figure out how one rifle did both. She almost smiled at that. Almost. Then a round cracked off the rock 6 feet to her left, close enough that stone chips stung her cheek, and the almost smile disappeared entirely. "Move," she told herself, already sliding backward on her elbows, dragging her rifle with her. Move, move, move. She'd trained for this 100 times on ranges in Oklahoma and Georgia, and once memorably in a driving rainstorm in Washington state that her instructor had called character building while she lay face down in mud for 6 hours. Fire and displace. Never stay in a position after you've been compromised. The rules existed because snipers who ignored them ended up as statistics, and Olivia had no intention of becoming one tonight, not when Marcus was still breathing, not when 8 men below were still trapped and still needed her eyes on that valley. She belly crawled 30 meters along a shallow depression in the rock, hauling her rifle and her pack, forcing herself not to look back at Marcus, even though every instinct in her screamed at her to stay beside him. Leaving him alone on that ridge felt like a betrayal carved directly into her chest. But staying beside him and dying together helped no one. Moving, surviving, fighting, that was the only version of loyalty that meant anything right now. She found a new position behind a cluster of boulders, dropped prone, and brought her scope back up, just in time to watch 4 enemy fighters break away from the main assault on the compound and begin working their way up the mountain trail toward her general position. 4 men hunting 1 woman with a bolt-action rifle and a dwindling supply of ammunition. She did the math the way she always did, fast and cold and without sentiment. 4 targets. Maybe 6 or 7 rounds left in her current magazine, 2 spare mags in her pack. Distance closing with every second they climbed. If she let them get within 100 meters, this stopped being a sniper's fight and became something far more desperate, far more equal, and equal was the last thing she wanted against 4 armed men on unfamiliar terrain. "Okay," she breathed. "Okay, Liv. One at a time." She sighted the lead climber, exhaled, and fired. The man dropped without a sound, tumbling backward down the slope he'd been climbing, and for half a second, the other 3 froze in the kind of confused paralysis that came from watching a friend die without understanding where death had come from. Olivia used that half second. She shifted her aim, found the second climber already scrambling for cover behind a boulder that wasn't quite big enough to hide him completely, and put a round through the exposed edge of his shoulder that spun him sideways into the open. Her third shot missed. The remaining 2 fighters had finally found real cover, and the round sparked harmlessly off stone, 6 inches from where a man's head had been a heartbeat earlier. "Damn it!" she hissed, already working the bolt, already recalculating. Below in the compound, Walker heard the exchange of fire rolling down from the mountainside and felt something twist painfully in his chest. Hope and dread wrapped so tightly together he could no longer separate them. "That's her," he said mostly to himself. "She's still up there." "Sir, we've got our own problem," Ramirez called, ducking, as a fresh burst of automatic fire chewed into the wall above his head. "They're regrouping on the south side, and I don't think our mystery sniper can watch every angle of this fight at once." He was right. Walker forced himself to stop staring up at the mountain and turn his attention back to the 8 walls of stone that were, for the moment, the only thing keeping his team alive. Sullivan was fading. Alvarez had said as much, without saying it directly. The particular quiet efficiency of a medic who'd stopped talking about outcomes and started simply working. Coleman had lost enough blood that his usual stream of profanity had gone thin and infrequent, which worried Walker more than the cursing ever had. And ammunition across the board was dropping toward numbers that made Walker's stomach clench every time he thought about the math. "Command, this is Reaper 1, he said into his radio voice tight. "Status on extraction, Bird. Reaper 1 Bird is 19 minutes out. Be advised, we've identified radio chatter suggesting hostile reinforcements moving toward your position from the north. Walker closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, allowing himself that much and no more. Reinforcements. As if 30-plus fighters hadn't already been more than enough. Copy, he said, because there was nothing else to say, no version of frustration that would change the numbers stacking up against them. Reaper 1 out. He turned to his team, and for a moment in the strobing light of muzzle flashes and the distant crack of a rifle he still couldn't place, he simply looked at them. 6 exhausted men, and 2 wounded faces, streaked with dirt and blood, and the particular hollow-eyed focus of soldiers who had stopped counting the odds because the odds no longer mattered. What mattered was the next 30 seconds and the 30 seconds after that. 19 minutes, Walker said. We hold 19 minutes and we go home. 19 minutes is a long time in a place like this, sir, Okafor said quietly, but he was already reloading, already turning back toward the wall, because 19 minutes or not, there was no version of this fight where lying down was an option. Up on the ridge, Olivia had relocated twice more in the space of 4 minutes, each time, firing each time, vanishing before the enemy's return. Fire found her, each time feeling the margin between herself and a bullet grow thinner. She'd stopped 2 more fighters from reaching flanking positions on the compound's east side. Not kills this time. Just wounds severe enough to pull them out of the fight, because ammunition was a resource now, and she couldn't afford to spend 2 rounds ensuring a kill, when 1 round ensuring a withdrawal accomplished the same tactical goal. She checked her remaining ammunition with a glance that felt more like a gut punch than a count. 1 magazine left in the rifle, 1 spare in her pack. Maybe 15 rounds total between them against an enemy force that, as far as she could tell through the chaos of muzzle flashes and shouted orders, hadn't shrunk by more than a handful despite everything she'd done. You're going to run dry before they run out of men, she told herself. Flat and clinical, the voice of an instructor rather than a frightened woman alone on a mountain. Make every shot count. Behind her, faint and broken, she heard something that made her entire body go still. Live. She spun rifle swinging before her brain caught up with the sound and recognized it. Not an enemy, not a threat, but Marcus, conscious his voice, a wet rasp that told her exactly how much blood he'd lost even before she crawled back to his position. Hey! She breathed relief crashing through her so hard it nearly broke something loose in her chest. Hey, stay with me. Don't move. You're going to be okay. Lying. Marcus managed the ghost of a smile flickering across gray lips. You're a terrible liar, Hayes. Shut up, she said, and there were tears in her voice now that she didn't have time to acknowledge, didn't have the luxury of feeling. She pressed her hand hard against the wound in his side, felt the warm slickness of blood soaking through in seconds despite the field dressing she'd applied earlier. Just shut up and breathe. I need you to breathe. Below us, Marcus whispered. Eyes fluttering, fighting to stay focused, despite everything his body was telling him to do. How many left, down there? I don't know, a lot. They're pinned, they're wounded, they're running out of time, same as we are. Then go, Marcus said, and even dying, even bleeding out on a cold mountainside, his voice found enough strength to make it an order. Go do your job, soldier. I'm not... He coughed, and Olivia's heart stopped until his chest rose again. I'm not going anywhere. Rock's not going anywhere either. Go. I'm not leaving you. You're not leaving me. Marcus agreed weaker, now his eyes already sliding shut again. You're just not sitting next to me. There's a difference, Hayes. Go be a sniper. Let me be a rock for 5 minutes. She wanted to argue. She wanted to scream at the unfairness of a universe that put her in a position where the only way to save the man beside her was to leave him bleeding alone in the dark. But he was right, and they both knew it, and some decisions in war weren't really decisions at all. They were just the truth arriving, whether you wanted it to or not. 5 minutes, she said, pressing one more piece of gauze against his wound with hands that shook despite every ounce of discipline she owned. I'll check on you every 5 minutes. Count them if you have to. Copy. Marcus breathed, and it was the last word he managed before his eyes closed again, and Olivia forced herself to crawl away from him, back toward her rifle, back toward the fight, carrying a weight in her chest that no amount of training had ever prepared her for. Below, the battle had entered a new and uglier phase. The enemy, having failed to overrun the compound in the initial assault, had shifted tactics, probing attacks from multiple directions, designed to force the SEALs to spread their diminishing ammunition across every wall, at once wearing them down through attrition rather than brute force. "They're testing us," Walker said grimly, watching a squad of fighters make a half-hearted rush at the north wall before pulling back the moment Ramirez's return fire found its mark. "Feeling out where we're weak." "We're weak everywhere, sir," Brooks said, not without dark humor, ejecting a spent magazine and slapping in one of his last two. "In case that wasn't clear," noted Brooks. A new voice cut through the enemy chatter below, different from before. Sharper, more controlled, and Walker felt every hair on his arms rise as he realized what it meant. The commander Olivia had killed earlier hadn't been running this operation alone. Someone else had stepped into command, someone who sounded even filtered through gunfire and distance, and a language Walker didn't speak, considerably more dangerous than the man who'd come before him. "New leadership," Okafor said grimly, apparently thinking the same thing. "Great. Just what tonight needed." The new commander's first order became apparent within 30 seconds, a coordinated push from 3 directions, simultaneously, fighters moving with far more discipline than the earlier chaotic assaults, clearly designed to overwhelm the compound's defenders before reinforcements or extraction could arrive. "Here they come!" Ramirez shouted, and the courtyard erupted into a sustained roar of gunfire that drowned out every other sound in the valley. Up on the ridge, Olivia saw the coordinated assault begin and understood immediately what it meant. This wasn't probing anymore. This was the enemy throwing everything they had left at the compound in one final decisive push, betting that overwhelming numbers would break through before the American extraction arrived. She didn't have time to think about ammunition conservation anymore. She didn't have time to think about anything except the 8 men below who were about to be overrun. She fired. A fighter rushing the north wall dropped mid-stride. She worked the bolt, shifted, fired again. Another fell, this one attempting to scale the compound's crumbling east wall. "Command Reaper 1. We are under heavy coordinated assault from 3 directions. I say again, 3 directions, requesting immediate air support if available." Walker's voice had lost its careful composure, now raw with the specific desperation of a man watching his worst-case scenario unfold in real time. "Reaper 1, negative on air support. Nearest asset is 30+ minutes out. Extraction bird remains your fastest option, currently 16 minutes to your position." 16 minutes might as well have been 16 hours. Walker looked at his team. Coleman barely upright, Sullivan unconscious. Now Alvarez working over him with an expression that told Walker everything he needed to know without a single word spoken, and made a decision that would have terrified him in any calmer moment. "We consolidate," he said. "Everyone to the north wall, tightest formation we can hold. We're not spreading thin anymore, we're making them pay for every meter." It was a desperate plan, the kind that existed only because every better option had already been exhausted. But desperate plans, Walker had learned over 3 deployments, sometimes worked precisely because the enemy never expected a cornered force to choose concentration over spread. Above, Olivia watched the SEALs pull into a tighter formation, and immediately understood the strategic shift, immediately recalculated her own priorities to match. If they were consolidating on the north wall, that meant the north wall needed to hold above everything else, which meant her rifle needed to be pointed at anyone approaching that wall and nowhere else. She fired. Missed. Cursed under her breath, worked. The bolt fired again, and this time watched a fighter crumple 10 meters from the north wall's crumbling stone. Her rifle clicked empty. For one heart-stopping second, panic flared through her chest before training took over. Hands moving on pure muscle memory, ejecting the spent magazine and slamming her last one home with practiced efficiency. Even as her mind screamed the truth at her. This was it. This was the last magazine she had, and when these rounds ran out, she had nothing left but a sidearm and a prayer. "Make them count," she whispered, chambering around. She fired again, and again. Each shot precisely placed, each shot buying the men below another few seconds, another few feet of ground, held rather than lost. The assault below began to falter, not because the enemy had run out of fighters, but because every fighter who exposed himself to reach the north wall was finding an invisible, impossible marksman waiting for him from a position nobody below could locate. "She's still up there!" Brooks shouted disbelief, and something close to joy cracking through his voice as another attacker dropped just meters from his position. "Whoever she is, she's still fighting." "Focus! Brooks, hold the line!" Walker snapped, but even he couldn't fully suppress the flicker of hope that flared in his chest at the sound of that distant rifle, still cracking, still finding targets, still buying his team the time they needed to survive. Then Olivia's rifle clicked empty again, and this time there was no spare magazine to reach for. She stared at the weapon in her hands for one long, terrible second, feeling the full weight of what that emptiness meant. Below, the assault was still grinding forward, fighters still pushing toward the north wall in numbers that hadn't meaningfully thinned despite everything she'd done. And she had nothing left to stop them with, except a sidearm that was accurate to maybe 50 meters on a good day, useless against targets 400 meters below her position. "Okay," she said out loud, forcing her voice steady, even though her hands were shaking now. Adrenaline and exhaustion and fear all tangling together in her chest. "Okay, think Hayes." She thought of Marcus unconscious behind her, running out of time, as surely as the men below were. She thought of 8 strangers fighting for their lives on nothing but faith that the sniper who'd saved them once might somehow save them again. She thought of every rule she'd already broken tonight, every piece of doctrine she'd already thrown away in favor of something simpler and more absolute. And she made a decision that no training manual would have ever recommended. She grabbed her rifle empty, useless as a weapon now, but not useless as a tool, and began moving not away from the fight, but down the mountainside, closer to the enemy, closer to danger, driven by a plan so reckless it barely qualified as a plan at all. If she couldn't shoot them from a distance anymore, she'd find another way to even the odds. She descended through broken rock and scrub brush, moving as quietly as exhaustion and urgency allowed, until she reached a position overlooking a narrow trail that she recognized from hours of studying the terrain before the mission ever began as the enemy's primary route for moving reinforcements up toward the compound. If she could block that trail even temporarily, even through nothing more than the threat of her presence, she might buy the SEALs the time they still desperately needed. She found a narrow choke point between 2 boulders, barely wide enough for a single man to pass through at a time, and settled into position with her sidearm, drawn, her breathing slow and controlled, despite every nerve in her body, screaming at the insanity of what she was about to attempt. She didn't have to wait long. 2 enemy fighters came around the bend in the trail, moving fast, clearly, reinforcements being rushed up to break the deadlock below. Olivia let them get closer than any sniper training had ever taught her, to let a target get close enough that this stopped being marksmanship and became something far more primal and far more dangerous. She fired twice fast, the reports of her sidearm sharp and close, in a way her rifle's distant crack had never been. Both men dropped, and for one dizzying moment, Olivia felt the full terrifying reality of what she'd just done crash over her. She was no longer a ghost on the mountain. She was standing in the open, exposed with an empty rifle and a half-spent sidearm, having just eliminated 2 men at a range that all but guaranteed the rest of the enemy force now knew almost exactly where she was. Radios below crackled with new urgency. Shouted orders shifted, redirecting fighters away from the compound and toward the trail toward her position. And Olivia understood with brutal clarity that she'd just bought the SEALs precious minutes at the cost of becoming the primary target of an enemy force that badly wanted her dead. "Come on then," she breathed, backing away from the choke point, already searching for her next position, her next advantage. "Come find me." Below, the pressure on the compound's north wall eased almost immediately as fighters peeled away, redirected toward the mountainside, toward the mysterious sniper who'd just proven she could bite even at close range. "They're pulling back!" Ramirez shouted, disbelief coloring his voice. "Sir, they're pulling back from the wall." Walker allowed himself exactly one breath of relief before forcing his mind back to the tactical reality in front of him. "She's drawing them off," he said slowly, understanding dawning with a mixture of awe and horror. "She's pulling them away from us." "That's insane," Okafor said, watching enemy fighters redirect up the mountainside in a chaotic scramble. She's alone up there, if they catch her. She's not asking for our opinion on the tactic, Chief, Walker said, voice tight. She's buying us the window we need. We use it. He turned to his team, eyes sweeping across exhausted, wounded, desperate faces that had somehow found one more reserve of strength buried beneath the fear. Sullivan needs immediate evac. Coleman's not far behind him. That sniper just cracked this fight wide open for us. We move to the landing zone now, while we still can. What about her, sir? Brooks asked, and the question hung in the air with a weight that Walker felt in his chest, like a physical blow. We get our wounded to that bird, Walker said, already moving, already directing his team into formation around Alvarez and the unconscious Sullivan. And then we figure out how to bring her home, too. Both things are true, Brooks. Move. Above them, unaware of the exact conversation happening below, but understanding its likely shape from years of experience with exactly this kind of impossible calculus. Olivia continued moving through the darkness, drawing fighters further and further from the compound, using terrain she'd studied for hours as a weapon in its own right. Narrow passages that forced pursuers into single-file loose scree that made silent tracking nearly impossible, elevation changes that let her use gravity and geography against men who outnumbered her by a margin that should have made this fight over already. She heard them behind her closer, now voices calling to each other in short bursts that told her they were coordinating a search pattern rather than blindly chasing. Someone up there, the new commander, probably had trained these men well, and Olivia felt every advantage her isolation had once given her narrowing with each passing minute. A round cracked past her head close enough that she felt the displaced air against her cheek, and she dropped, instantly rolling behind a boulder as 3 more rounds chewed into the stone where she'd been standing. "Found me," she breathed, pulse-hammering sidearm gripped tight in both hands. Okay. They found me. She was pinned now, genuinely pinned in a way she hadn't been all night. Enemy fire keeping her low, while she heard boots scrambling across rock fighters, closing the distance with the confidence of men who knew they finally had their target cornered. This was the moment she understood with sudden, terrible clarity where the story of tonight might end very differently than she'd hoped. Alone, out of rifle ammunition, sidearm running low, surrounded by a terrain she'd chosen for its tactical value, but that now felt more like a trap closing around her than a weapon she controlled. She thought of Marcus alone on the ridge behind her, unconscious, trusting her to come back. She thought of 8 men she'd never properly met. Currently, she hoped, she prayed, moving toward a helicopter that would carry them home because of choices she'd made tonight. And she thought with a clarity that surprised her, even in the chaos of the moment, that if this was where it ended, it would at least end having meant something. Not every soldier got that. Not every sacrifice bought anything worth the cost. Hers had. Whatever happened in the next 60 seconds, 8 men were alive right now who wouldn't have been without her. That thought, strange as it was, steadied her hands. She waited until the boots grew close enough to place with certainty, until she could hear breathing on the other side of her boulder, and then she moved fast, low sidearm leading, and put 2 rounds into the first fighter who came around the rock before he'd even fully registered her presence. The second fighter got a shot off before she could turn, and fire exploded through Olivia's left arm, spinning her half around, a scream tearing out of her throat before she could stop it. But even through the white-hot shock of the wound training held, and her return shot caught him center mass before he could fire again. Silence fell sudden and disorienting after the chaos of close combat, broken only by Olivia's own ragged breathing and the distant continuing crack of gunfire from somewhere far below. She looked down at her arm, at the blood already soaking through her sleeve, and felt a wave of dizziness that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with a bullet that had passed clean through muscle close enough to bone that every movement sent fresh agony lancing up toward her shoulder. "Move," she told herself, voice barely a whisper, forcing her body upright despite every signal it was sending, urging her to simply stop, to rest, to let the darkness at the edges of her vision have its way. You don't get to stop yet. Below at the landing zone, Walker watched the horizon with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Counting seconds, counting minutes, willing the helicopter into existence through sheer force of need. Sullivan lay motionless on an improvised stretcher, Alvarez still working over him with the focused calm of a man refusing to accept any other outcome. Coleman leaned heavily against Ramirez, conscious, but fading his earlier profanity, long since gone silent. "Birds inbound 90 seconds," came the voice on Walker's radio, and for the first time in what felt like hours, something in his chest loosened just slightly, just enough to breathe. "Copy," he said, and then, because he couldn't help himself, because the woman on that mountain had earned at least this much, he added, "Command, has anyone identified our Overwatch? I want a name. I want to know who saved my team tonight." There was a pause on the other end, long enough that Walker wondered if the question had simply been lost in the chaos of a night that had already asked too much of everyone involved. "Reaper 1, working on that identification now. Be advised, Overwatch position reported multiple engagements, is confirmed, still active as of 90 seconds ago, but has not re-established radio contact. Still active, still fighting, still alive. As of 90 seconds ago, though 90 seconds in a fight like this could mean everything or nothing at all. The helicopter's rotors became audible before its silhouette cut against the night sky, and Walker felt his team's collective exhale as clearly as if it had been his own breath. They loaded Sullivan first, then Coleman, then the rest of the team scrambling aboard, with the particular urgent grace of men who'd survived something they genuinely believed might kill them. Walker was the last one aboard, and as the helicopter lifted off the ground, he found himself staring back up at the dark shape of the mountain, searching uselessly for any sign of the woman who'd turned an impossible night into a night his team would walk away from. "Sir," the pilot's voice crackled through his headset, "we need to move. We're taking fire from the ridge. I can't hold position." "I know," Walker said, and the two words carried a weight he couldn't fully express in acknowledgement of a debt he had no idea, yet how he'd ever repay. "Get us out of here." The helicopter banked away from the valley, carrying 8 men, 6 wounded, 2 exhausted, all of them alive, toward safety, toward a base, and a debrief, and a story that would need explaining to commanders who wouldn't believe it without proof. And on the mountain behind them, bleeding alone out of rifle ammunition and running critically low on everything else, Olivia Hayes heard the helicopter's rotors fade into the distance and understood with a strange and terrible peace that she was now completely on her own. She dragged herself back toward the ridge toward Marcus, her wounded arm hanging useless at her side, every step costing more than the last. When she finally reached him, he was still breathing shallow, faint but there, and she collapsed beside him with something between relief and despair. "Still here," she whispered, checking his pulse with trembling fingers. "Still with me. Good. That's good, Marcus." Below, the valley had gone eerily quiet. The enemy's coordinated assault broken, scattered but not defeated. And Olivia knew with the certainty of someone who understood exactly how these fights ended, that quiet in a battle like this one was never peace. It was only ever the pause before whatever came next. Quiet in a fight like this one was never peace. Olivia understood that with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water, and less than 90 seconds after the helicopter's rotors faded into the eastern sky, that certainty proved itself correct. Voices. Below her position, moving up the trail, closer than she wanted, closer than she had time to prepare for. "Marcus." She pressed 2 fingers against his throat, found his pulse thready but present, and allowed herself exactly 1 breath of relief before forcing her mind back into the cold clinical space where fear couldn't slow her hands down. "I need you to stay quiet. Can you do that for me?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. But his eyelids fluttered just slightly, just enough to tell her some part of him was still fighting alongside her, even from the edge of unconsciousness. She dragged him behind a shelf of rock, positioned her body between him and the trail below, and drew her sidearm with a hand that trembled from blood loss and adrenaline in equal measure. Her left arm hung mostly useless now, the wound from earlier stiffening with every passing minute, and she knew without needing a mirror that the field dressing she'd wrapped around it one-handed wasn't going to hold much longer. 2, she whispered, counting the voices as they drew closer. Maybe 3. She was wrong. There were 4. They came around the bend in a loose formation, rifles up, moving with the particular caution of men who'd already lost friends to whatever was hiding in these rocks and had no intention of losing more without a fight. Olivia watched them through a gap in the stone, watched the lead man pause, crouch, examine something on the ground. Blood, she realized, with a sick lurch in her stomach. Her blood. She'd left a trail without meaning to, drops soaking into the dirt during her scramble back up the mountainside, and now 4 armed men were following it directly toward the one thing in the world she couldn't afford to lose. "Okay," she breathed, so quiet even she barely heard it. "Okay, Hayes. Think." 4 men. 1 sidearm with maybe 6 rounds left. A wounded arm that could barely support the weapon's weight, let alone control its recoil through 6 rapid shots. And behind her, an unconscious man who would die in minutes if these fighters reached him, whether by bullet or simply by the loss of the one person keeping pressure on his wound. The math didn't work. She knew that with the same clarity she'd known every piece of battlefield math all night. But the math had been wrong before, or rather she had refused to let it be the only truth in the equation, and she wasn't about to start trusting it now. She spotted a loose scattering of rock along the trail's edge, remnants of some long-ago rock slide, precarious and waiting. She didn't have a grenade. She didn't have anything close to one. But she had gravity, and she had 4 men walking directly beneath an unstable ledge, and sometimes that was enough. She eased herself sideways, keeping low, keeping silent, until she reached a jagged outcrop directly above the trail. Her wounded arm screamed in protest as she braced herself against the stone, but she ignored it, focused entirely on the loose boulder wedged at the outcrop's edge. 1 good push away from tumbling down onto the path below. The lead fighter was almost directly beneath her now. She pushed. The boulder gave way with a grinding groan that turned instantly into a roar as it dragged half the loose scree down the slope with it, an avalanche in miniature, crashing directly onto the trail below. Shouts of alarm turned to screams as the lead fighter went down hard, buried to the waist in rock and dust, and the man behind him stumbled backward, arms flailing, trying to avoid a fate he only barely escaped. Olivia didn't wait to see the results. She was already moving, sliding back down toward her position with her sidearm raised, using the chaos and the choking cloud of dust as cover. 2 fighters emerged from the debris, coughing, disoriented, weapons raised, but firing blind into a dust cloud with no clear target. Olivia found the closer one first, put 2 rounds into him before he even registered her presence, and spun toward the second, just as he located her through the settling haze. His rifle swung toward her a half-second too slow. Her 3rd and 4th shots caught him center mass, and he folded backward without a sound. 2 down. 2 more somewhere in the settling dust, and her sidearm slide had locked back on an empty chamber, and Olivia felt something close to despair claw up her throat as she realized with brutal finality that she had nothing left to shoot with at all. "Move," she snarled at herself, dropping the useless weapon and yanking her combat knife from its sheath instead. "Move! Move! Move!" A shape lunged out of the dust toward her, and Olivia's body reacted before her mind fully processed the threat. She twisted sideways, felt the heat of a blade meant for her ribs, instead scrape across her side, and drove her knife upward in a motion drilled into her. Through years of close-quarters training, she'd never expected to actually need. The fighter gasped, staggered, went still. Olivia stood over him, chest heaving, blood hers, his she genuinely didn't know anymore, dripping from her hands, and for one long, terrible moment, the entire mountain seemed to hold its breath around her. Then the 4th man stepped out of the dust rifle, already raised, already aimed directly at her chest, and Olivia understood with a strange floating clarity that she had run out of tricks. No ammunition, no cover, nothing but a bloody knife and a body that was barely holding itself upright. "Drop it," the fighter said in accented but clear English, his rifle steady despite the chaos around them. "Drop the knife." Olivia's mind raced through options and found none of them good. She could throw the knife, a desperate, unlikely gamble against a man who already had the drop on her. She could lunge and probably die before covering half the distance between them. Or she could do exactly what he said and hope that whatever came next left room for another chance. She let the knife fall, Good. The fighter said, something ugly flickering across his face. Satisfaction, maybe? Or the particular cruelty of a man who'd just cornered the person responsible for so many of his friends' deaths tonight. You, American sniper, very much trouble tonight. Guilty, Olivia said, and even now, even with a rifle pointed at her heart, some stubborn, defiant part of her couldn't quite let the moment pass without at least that much. The fighter's finger tightened on the trigger, and then from somewhere behind him, a voice barked a single sharp command in a language Olivia didn't understand, but recognized instantly by tone, an order, urgent, absolute. The fighter hesitated, lowered his rifle just slightly, clearly torn between the order he'd just received and the satisfaction he'd been about to take. A second man emerged from the darkness, beyond the dust. Older, harder-eyed, moving with the unmistakable authority of command, and Olivia understood in an instant that this was the new commander, the one who'd taken over after her earlier shot had ended the previous leader's life on the valley floor below. He studied her for a long moment, taking in the blood, the wounded arm, the exhaustion written across every line of her body, and something that might have been respect, or might simply have been calculation, crossed his face. You are the one. He said, his English precise, careful, the product of education rather than necessity. The one who killed Rashid, who has killed so many of my men tonight. Olivia said nothing. There was nothing useful to say, and every second she stayed silent was a second she remained alive. You could have died 3 times over. The commander continued, circling her, slowly studying her, the way a man studies something he's trying to understand, rather than simply destroy. My men wanted to kill you the moment they found you. I stopped them. Why? Olivia managed, voice rough, forcing the word out through a throat gone dry with fear she refused to let show on her face. Because a dead American sniper tells us nothing, the commander said simply. A living one brought back to those who sent her here tells us everything. Who ordered this operation? What other targets exist? How many more of you are hiding in these mountains? And there it was, the truth. Beneath everything, the reason 4 men had followed her blood trail up a mountainside, instead of simply putting a bullet in her from a distance and calling it done. They didn't want her dead. They wanted her captured, wanted her as a prize, as a source, as something far worse than the quick, clean end a bullet would have offered. You're wasting your time, Olivia said, forcing steel into her voice despite everything screaming at her to simply collapse under the weight of exhaustion and blood loss. I don't know anything you want to hear. We will see, the commander said almost gently, and gestured to his remaining fighter. Bind her. We move before the Americans send more of their soldiers looking for their missing angel. Olivia's mind raced, even as rough hands grabbed her wounded arm, sending fire lancing up through her shoulder hard enough to nearly buckle her knees. Behind her, hidden in the rocks, Marcus was still unconscious, still bleeding, still utterly unaware that the woman who'd promised to keep checking on him every 5 minutes was about to be dragged away into the dark, with no one left to find either of them. She had to do something. Anything. Wait, she gasped, as the fighter began binding her wrists with rough cord that bit into already abused skin. Wait, there's someone. My spotter. He's wounded. He is not our concern, the commander said flatly, already turning to leave. He'll die, Olivia said, and the desperation in her voice was real now. Unmasked, because whatever happened to her in the next few hours, she couldn't bear the thought of Marcus dying alone on a mountainside, because she'd failed to buy him even that small mercy. He's already dying. Please, just leave him where he is. Don't finish what your fighter started. The commander studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Then, unexpectedly, he nodded once sharp and final. We are not here to kill wounded men who cannot fight, he said. We are here for you. Move. They dragged her away from Marcus's hidden position, down the mountainside, away from the compound, away from everything. Olivia had spent the entire night fighting to protect, and with every step, she felt something close to despair settling into her chest. Not for herself, not entirely, but for the 8 men who'd escaped believing their guardian angel was still watching over them, when in truth, she was now being marched deeper into enemy territory, with her hands bound and her rifle abandoned, somewhere on a mountainside she might never see again. Nearly 30 miles away, at a forward operating base that felt in this moment impossibly distant from the valley that had nearly claimed 8 lives. That night, Lieutenant Commander Ethan Walker stood in a debrief room that smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee, staring at a base commander whose expression told him everything he needed to know before the man even opened his mouth. "Sir, with respect, we cannot leave her out there," Walker said, and his voice, usually so controlled, cracked with an intensity that surprised even him. "She's the reason my entire team is standing in this room right now instead of body bags. Commander Walker, I understand the debt you feel," Colonel Reyes said, not unkindly, but with the flat, immovable tone of a man who had already made his decision and disliked having to defend it twice. "But I have 0 confirmed identification on this individual. I have no verified status. What I have is a chaotic account of an unnamed sniper engaging hostile forces from an unknown position and a valley that our own intelligence now suggests contains a hostile force nearly triple what we originally briefed. She has a name," Walker said. "Overwatch. She was assigned to my mission. Someone in this building knows exactly who she is." Reyes's jaw tightened. "We're working on confirming that. Work faster," Walker snapped, and immediately regretted the tone, though not the sentiment. He took a breath, forced himself back towards something resembling professional composure. "Sir, Sullivan is in surgery right now because of a bullet meant to hit all 3 of us on that exposed run to the north gate. He's alive because someone on that mountain put 2 rounds into a machine gun crew before it could open fire. I owe that person my team's lives, all of us do. And I owe my command the lives of whatever soldiers I send back into that valley," Reyes said. "Do you understand what you're asking me to authorize a rescue mission at night into a valley we now believe holds a reinforced hostile company based on nothing but the word of exhausted men who admit they never actually saw this sniper's face?" Walker opened his mouth to argue, and found for a long, frustrated moment that he had no answer that would satisfy a commander weighing risk against uncertainty. He understood Reyes's position. He hated it, but he understood it. "Sir," he said, finally quieter now, "if the situation were reversed, if it was one of my men still out there, would you be asking me these questions, or would you already have a bird in the air?" Reyes didn't answer immediately, and in that silence, Walker saw something shift, some crack in the colonel's carefully maintained calculus. "Get me a name," Reyes said finally. "Get me a confirmed identification. Get me proof of life, and I will personally push this up the chain until someone authorizes a rescue asset. But I cannot send American soldiers back into that valley chasing a ghost commander. I need something real to justify the risk." It wasn't the answer Walker wanted, but it was, he recognized, the only answer he was likely to get in the next few minutes. He nodded, turned, and left the debrief room, already pulling his phone from his pocket, already running through every contact he had, who might be able to pull records fast enough to matter. He found Doc Alvarez in the hallway outside the medical bay, leaning against the wall, with the particular exhausted stillness of a man who'd spent the last hour keeping someone else alive through sheer force of will. "How's Sullivan?" Walker asked. "Stable? Barely. Surgeons think he'll make it, but it's going to be a long road." Alvarez's eyes were red-rimmed, his hands still faintly stained, despite the scrubbing Walker knew he'd done. "Coleman's already patched and complaining, which is a good sign, honestly. Man doesn't stop talking, it usually means he's fine." Walker allowed himself a small tired smile at that. "Small mercies, sir." Alvarez's voice shifted quieter, more serious. "That sniper, whoever she was. If Sullivan makes it, and I think he will, now it's because of her. That machine gun position would have torn through all 3 of you on that run. I saw the angle. There was no cover, nothing." "I know," Walker said. "Believe me, I know." "So what happens now?" "We just leave her out there." Walker's jaw tightened. "Not if I have anything to say about it. but command needs a name before they'll authorize anything, and right now all we have is a ghost story and a debt we can't repay. Back on the mountain, Olivia stumbled along a narrow trail with her hands bound and two armed fighters flanking her, the commander walking ahead with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed he'd already won the most important part of tonight's fight. Her mind raced through options, each one more desperate than the last, searching for any opening, any weakness, any moment where exhausted, overconfident captors might slip. It came sooner than she expected. The trail narrowed at a bend where a shallow ravine dropped away sharply to one side, and the fighter directly behind her, younger than the others, less disciplined. His attention drifting toward his radio, as chatter crackled through it, drifted just slightly out of position, just close enough. Olivia didn't think. She acted, throwing her bound hands upward and back in a motion that caught the young fighter across the jaw hard enough to stagger him, and before he could recover, she drove her shoulder into his chest and shoved with everything her exhausted body had left. He toppled backward into the ravine with a startled cry that cut off abruptly against the rocks below. The second fighter spun, rifle rising, and Olivia was already moving, sprinting into the darkness of the ravine's edge, with her hands still bound, driven by nothing but pure animal desperation. A round cracked past her, then another, and she felt one graze her calf with a burning line of fire that nearly dropped her. But she kept moving, kept running, throwing herself over a low ridge and down into a gully, thick with brush and shadow. Behind her, she heard the commander shouting orders, heard boots crashing through brush in pursuit, and she knew with grim certainty that she had bought herself seconds, not minutes. A wounded woman with bound hands couldn't outrun trained fighters on their own terrain for long. She spotted a jagged rock and threw herself against it, working her bound wrists frantically across its sharp edge, cord fraying, tearing her skin, tearing along with it. But she didn't care. Couldn't afford to care, not with pursuit closing in with every passing second. The cord snapped. Her hands free now but slicked with blood and shaking violently, fumbled at her side for anything useful and found tucked into her vest where it had been forgotten. In the chaos of capture, a small emergency signal flare, standard issue, meant for exactly this kind of last resort situation, and Olivia had never in her career been more grateful for a piece of equipment she'd almost stopped carrying months ago after deciding it added unnecessary weight. She didn't fire it yet. Not with enemy fighters closing in. Not when a flash of light would do nothing but paint a target directly onto her position. She tucked it back into her vest and kept moving instead deeper into the gully, using the darkness and the terrain the same way she had all night, turning the mountain itself into the only ally she had left. Behind her, the search intensified. She could hear the commander's voice, sharper now, edged with the particular frustration of a man watching his prize slip through his fingers. And she used every scrap of training she had to become nothing more than shadow and silence, freezing motionless behind cover, as flashlight beams swept past her position, close enough to touch. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Her wounded arm throbbed with a deep grinding pain that told her infection was already setting in. Her calf burned where the round had grazed it, and every breath felt like it cost more than the last. But she stayed still, stayed silent, stayed alive. And slowly, gradually, the sounds of pursuit began to drift further away, fighters spreading out across the mountainside in a search pattern that for now had lost her exact trail. When she finally judged it safe enough to move, she made her way back toward Marcus's position, with agonizing slowness, every sense straining for any sign of danger. Every step a negotiation between speed and silence. She found him exactly where she'd left him, and for one terrifying moment, kneeling beside him in the dark, she couldn't tell if he was breathing at all. "Marcus." Her voice broke on his name. "Marcus, come on, stay with me." His chest rose. Faint, shallow, but there. "Thank God," she whispered, and allowed herself for just a moment to feel the full weight of everything that had happened in the last hour. The capture, the escape, the fight for her own life, that she'd somehow impossibly won. She checked her surroundings, confirmed no immediate threat, and turned her attention to the radio she'd stripped from the young fighter, before shoving him into the ravine, a piece of equipment that had survived the fall, even though its owner hadn't, and that now represented Olivia's only possible connection to anyone who might help. She turned the dial with shaking fingers, scanning frequencies, listening to bursts of chatter in a language she couldn't understand, mixed with static and silence, searching for anything, any signal, any chance. And then, faintly buried beneath layers of interference, she caught something that made her heart stop. An American voice. Distant, distorted, but unmistakably American, running through standard radio protocols on a frequency close enough to military channels that it had to be intentional. Someone back at base, trying every possible frequency in the hope that a signal might somehow reach a position they'd lost contact with hours ago. Any station. This is Falcon Base attempting contact with Overwatch element. If you copy, respond on this frequency. I say again, any station copy. Olivia's hands shook as she found the transmit button, her voice barely more than a rasp after everything the night had put her through.
Falcon Base,
she said, forcing the words out through exhaustion and pain and disbelief that this might actually be working. Falcon Base, this is Overwatch. I say again, this is Overwatch. Does anyone copy? Static answered her first agonizing seconds of it, and Olivia felt despair creeping back in, certain the signal hadn't carried, certain she was simply screaming into a void that had swallowed every prayer she'd sent into it tonight. Then breaking through the static, a voice that made her chest tighten with something close to relief and something close to grief, all tangled together. Overwatch, this is Falcon Base. We copy. Say again, your status. Say again, your position. Olivia closed her eyes for one brief, overwhelming second before she keyed the radio again, her voice steadying despite everything, because there was work still left to do, because Marcus was still bleeding beside her, and Dawn was still hours away, and the mountain was still crawling with fighters who wanted her dead, or worse than dead. Falcon Base, she said. This is Staff Sergeant Olivia Hayes. I have one wounded urgent and I am currently evading a hostile force estimated at company strength moving to reinforce this valley. I need immediate extraction and I need it fast. The line went briefly silent, and when the voice returned it carried something Olivia hadn't expected to hear tonight, an edge of desperate, disbelieving hope. Copy Sergeant Hayes, stand by. Stand by, we have your Reaper element requesting confirmation of exactly this transmission. Do not move from a defensible position. Help is coming. Olivia looked down at Marcus, at his pale, unconscious face, at the blood that had soaked through nearly every dressing she'd applied over the last several desperate hours, and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since the moment this nightmare began. Hope. Fragile, uncertain, but real. Copy Falcon Base, she said. We'll be here. We're not going anywhere. Somewhere behind her, faint but unmistakable, she heard the sound of boots moving through brush once more, and understood with a sinking certainty that cut straight through the hope she'd just allowed herself to feel that the enemy commander wasn't finished searching for her yet, and that whatever help was coming would have to arrive before he found her again, or none of tonight's impossible survival would matter at all. Boots in the brush, closer now. Olivia killed the radio's volume with a snap of her thumb and pressed herself flat against the rock beside Marcus, her pulse hammering so hard she was certain it could be heard from 10 feet away. Please, she breathed, not entirely sure who she was praying to anymore. Please, not now. The footsteps paused. She heard low voices exchanging words in that same clipped, urgent tone she'd learned to associate with the enemy commander's most trusted men. And then, mercifully, the sounds began to drift away again, the search pattern sweeping past her position rather than through it. She counted to 60 before she allowed herself to breathe normally again. Back at Falcon Base in a command room that had gone from quiet frustration to controlled chaos in the span of 90 seconds, Colonel Reyes stood over a radio operator's shoulder, staring at a transcript that was already being read aloud to him a second time because the first time hadn't quite seemed real. Say that again, Reyes said. Staff Sergeant Olivia Hayes, sir. Confirmed by service number and unit designation. She's requesting immediate extraction. One wounded urgent, that's her spotter Sergeant Marcus Reed, and she's reporting a hostile force at company strength, actively hunting her position. Walker was in the room before the operator finished the sentence, having sprinted the length of the hallway the moment word reached him. You have her. You have confirmation. We have confirmation, Reyes said, and something in his weathered face shifted the careful, guarded caution of the last hour, giving way to something closer to resolve. Staff Sergeant Hayes, Army Attachment Sniper qualification assigned Overwatch for tonight's operation. He looked up, meeting Walker's eyes. You were right, Commander. She's real, she's alive, and she's still out there fighting. Then get me a bird, Walker said, already moving toward the door. Commander. Sir, with respect, you said get you a name and proof of life, and now you have both. Sullivan's alive because of her. Coleman's alive because of her. My entire team walked off that mountain because a 28-year-old sniper decided our lives were worth more than her own exposure, and she is still out there right now bleeding hunted, keeping her spotter alive with nothing but grit and a stolen radio. I am not letting her fight this fight alone for one more hour than I have to. Reyes studied him for a long moment, and then turned to the operations officer standing at the edge of the room. Get me a rescue package. Air support, quick reaction force, the works. I want eyes in that valley in the next 15 minutes. Sir, that valley is still hot, the officer said carefully. Last reports had hostile numbers at company strength, possibly reinforced. I'm aware, Reyes said, and something hard settled into his voice, the tone of a commander who had made his decision and would not be revisiting it. Staff Sergeant Hayes single-handedly disrupted that force enough to get 8 American operators out alive tonight. I think we owe her the same courtesy. Move. Walker felt something loosen in his chest for the first time since the helicopter had lifted off that mountainside without her. He turned toward the door, already thinking through logistics, already calculating who he needed on this mission, and found Jake Sullivan's fiancée's face flashing unbidden through his mind, a woman named Grace, who didn't yet know how close she'd come to planning a funeral instead of a wedding, and who would never know, unless Olivia Hayes made it home, to exactly whose sacrifice had bought her fiancé's survival. I want to go, he said, turning back to Reyes. Sir, I want on that extraction team. Commander, you've been fighting since 0200. Your team is wounded, exhausted. My team, Walker said, will want to be there too, all of them. Even the ones on stretchers if you'd let them. As if summoned by the words themselves, the door swung open, and Jake Sullivan's bunkmate, Petty Officer Diego Ramirez, still wearing the grime and blood of the night's fighting, stepped into the room with Brooks and Okafor close behind him. Sir, Ramirez said, words going around the team. Is it true she's alive? She's alive, Walker confirmed. And we're going back for her. Something passed through the small group, like a current exhaustion burning away in an instant, replaced by a fierce, focused energy that Walker recognized because he felt it too, the particular resolve of men who understood a debt when they saw one and had no intention of leaving it unpaid. Then we're coming, Brooks said, and it wasn't a question. Coleman wants in too, Okafor added. He's arguing with the medics right now about his discharge status. Doc's about ready to sedate him just to get him to sit still. Even Reyes, watching this unfold, allowed himself a small, tired smile. I can authorize 4 of you, he said. Not the wounded. I need Coleman and Sullivan in that medical bay, not on a helicopter. But the rest of you, if you're volunteering, and if flight surgeons clear you, I won't stand in the way. We're volunteering, Walker said, and the 3 men behind him nodded in unison. Word of the rescue mission spread through the base faster than Reyes' official channels could contain it, and within 20 minutes, as the quick reaction force finished loading equipment onto a pair of Blackhawks on the flight line, a young medic, Walker, recognized the same soldier Olivia had begged the enemy commander to spare on the mountainside. Though Walker had no way of knowing that detail, yet approached him with a look of fierce determination on a face still pale from blood loss. Wait, that detail belonged to a different soldier, one whose name Walker hadn't yet connected to the woman who'd saved his team's lives. The local man, Olivia had prevented from execution back in the compound courtyard, the one who'd knelt trembling in the dirt as the enemy commander's pistol lowered from his skull, had been recovered separately by another element and brought to base for processing, and now stood at the edge of the flight line, insisting through a translator that he be allowed to help. He says he knows the terrain, the translator explained to Walker, gesturing toward the young local man who couldn't have been more than 19, his hands still trembling faintly from the ordeal of nearly dying hours earlier. He says the woman who saved his life is still up there. He wants to guide you." Walker studied the young man for a long moment, genuine fear still etched into his face, but beneath it, something steadier, something that looked a great deal like the same debt Walker himself was determined to repay. "Tell him thank you," Walker said. "Tell him we've got this, but tell him I understand exactly why he's asking." The young man said something further, and the translator relayed it with a small surprised smile of his own. "He says she didn't leave him, so he won't ask to be left behind either." Walker felt something tighten in his throat that had nothing to do with exhaustion. "Get him a vest," he said finally. "If Reyes clears it, he stays with the support element at the LZ, not forward, but he comes." On the mountainside, Olivia had shifted Marcus into the most stable position she could manage, packing what remained of her medical supplies against his wound with hands that had long since stopped fully obeying her commands. Blood loss and exhaustion had begun to blur the edges of her vision, small gray patches creeping in and out at the periphery no matter how hard she blinked them away. "Stay with me," she murmured more to herself than to him now, her voice thin and frayed. "Just a little longer, Marcus. Help's coming, I promise." She heard something shift in the brush nearby and went rigid, hand fumbling for the radio ready to signal, ready to warn, and then relaxed marginally when she recognized the sound as wind rather than boots. Her nerves had stretched so thin that every rustling leaf now sounded like an execution squad closing in, and she knew with the clinical detachment of someone who'd trained other soldiers on the symptoms that she was running dangerously close to the edge of what her body could sustain without collapsing entirely. The radio crackled. "Overwatch, this is Reaper 1. Walker's voice, and Olivia felt something in her chest crack open at the sound of it. Relief so overwhelming, it nearly broke through the careful composure she'd been holding on to for hours. "Say again, your position. We are inbound, ETA, 1 to 2 minutes. Reaper 1. She managed her voice rough but steady enough to be understood. "This is Overwatch. Copy your inbound. I am holding position on the northern ridge approximately 800 meters above the original compound. 1 wounded urgent deteriorating. I have hostiles actively searching this area. Estimate they remain within 400 meters of my position. Copy Overwatch. Hold tight. We're coming for you." "Copy," Olivia said. And something in the simple exchange of that word, the mutual understanding between two people who'd never met but had already trusted each other with their lives, steadied her more than she expected. But 400 meters, she knew from bitter experience tonight, was not nearly far enough. The enemy commander, still furious at the escape of his prize captive, had redoubled his search efforts with a focus that bordered on obsession, driving his remaining fighters through the mountainside with an intensity that suggested he understood exactly what capturing an American sniper, or better yet, killing the extraction force sent to rescue her, would mean for whatever remained of his operation's credibility. He heard the helicopters before Olivia did the distant thrum of rotors carrying across the valley, and his expression hardened into something calculating and cold. "They come for her," he said to the fighter beside him, switching briefly into English out of some twisted satisfaction at being understood by no one but himself in that moment. "Good. Let them come. We will make this valley a graveyard for all of them." He began redirecting his remaining forces, positioning fighters along likely approach routes, setting up a hasty but deadly ambush designed to catch the extraction force exactly where he expected Olivia's position to be, and Olivia, monitoring enemy chatter through the stolen radio, with growing dread, realized with sickening clarity what was about to happen. "Reaper 1, she said urgently, keying her radio despite the risk of the transmission being intercepted. "Be advised, hostiles are repositioning. I believe they anticipate your approach vector and are establishing ambush positions along the northern ridge access route." "Copy Overwatch, understood. Can you confirm exact enemy positions?" Olivia hesitated for exactly 1 second, weighing the cost of what she was about to do against the alternative of staying silent and letting 4 more Americans fly directly into a trap. "Negative confirmed positions," she said, "but I can draw them. Diverting hostile attention now. Watch for a different approach vector. I say again, Expect enemy contact concentrated toward the original compound area rather than my current position. Overwatch negative, do not expose your position, I say again. But Olivia had already made her decision, and there was no version of tonight where she was going to let caution win out over the lives of men who were flying directly into danger to save her. She grabbed the flare she'd been saving, moved 30 meters from Marcus's hidden position, close enough to return quickly, far enough to draw attention away from him, and fired it into the sky. The flare burst overhead in a brilliant, unmistakable flare of red light visible for miles, and Olivia watched with grim satisfaction as enemy fighters below immediately began redirecting toward the new signal exactly as she'd hoped. "There!" she breathed, already moving back toward Marcus, her wounded leg screaming with every step. "Come get me now!" The enemy commander's head snapped toward the flare's crimson glow, fury and calculation warring across his face in equal measure. "She reveals herself," he snarled. "Move before the helicopters arrive." Fighters redirected en masse toward the flare's position, streaming across the mountainside with weapons raised, and Olivia, watching them approach from her new vantage point, felt her heart hammering against her ribs with a fear that no amount of training had ever fully conquered. She had no rifle, no sidearm, nothing left but a knife, a nearly dead radio, and a wounded man who needed her more than she'd ever needed anything in her life. "Reaper 1, she said, voice tight. "I have multiple hostiles converging on my position. Danger close. I need that extraction now. Overwatch, ETA 3 minutes. Hold on. 3 minutes." Olivia looked at the approaching flashlight beams, sweeping across the rocks at the shapes of armed men closing the distance with brutal efficiency, and understood that 3 minutes might as well have been 3 hours. She grabbed Marcus under the arms, ignoring the fire in her wounded shoulder, and began dragging him inch by agonizing inch toward a narrow crevice in the rock she'd noted earlier as a potential last-ditch defensive position. Every movement cost her dearly, blood loss and exhaustion combining into a fog that made even simple actions feel like wading through mud, but she kept moving, kept dragging, kept refusing to let the darkness pulling at the edges of her vision win. She wedged Marcus into the crevice, positioned herself in front of him, with nothing but her knife and pure defiance, and watched the first enemy fighter crest the ridge less than 50 meters away. "Not tonight," she whispered, echoing the words that had started this entire impossible fight hours earlier. "Not him, not tonight." The fighter spotted her, shouted an alert, and raised his rifle, and in that same instant, the night exploded with a new and different sound. One that made the enemy fighter's head snap upward in confusion and dawning horror. Helicopter rotors closed, now impossibly close, and then muzzle flashes from a door gunner's weapon cutting through the darkness with devastating precision. Walker's Black Hawk banked hard over the ridge door gunner, laying down suppressive fire that scattered the approaching fighters like leaves in a hurricane. And Olivia watched with something between disbelief and overwhelming relief as the helicopter settled into a hover just above the rocky terrain, close enough that she could see figures already preparing to fast rope down. "There?" Walker's voice shouting, now audible even over the rotor wash. "There, that's her position. Get us down." Walker hit the ground, running rifle up, covering the approach as Ramirez and Brooks descended behind him, and for one surreal suspended moment, Olivia found herself staring across 50 meters of chaos at the man whose voice she'd heard on the radio for hours without ever seeing his face. "Sergeant Hayes!" Walker shouted, already moving toward her position, laying down fire at anything that moved on the ridge around them. "I'm Walker, Reaper 1. We're getting you out of here." "My spotter!" Olivia gasped, exhaustion finally cracking her voice as he reached her position. "He's critical. He needs—" "Got him," Ramirez said, already crouching beside Marcus, checking vitals with quick professional hands. "Pulse is thready, but he's hanging on. We need to move now." Enemy fire intensified from below. Fighters regrouping, despite the door gunner's suppressive fire, and Walker grabbed Olivia's good arm, half supporting her weight as she stumbled toward the waiting helicopter. "Can you move?" "I can move," she said, though her legs felt like they belonged to someone else entirely, someone with far less blood remaining in their body. They loaded Marcus, first Ramirez, and Brooks working with practiced urgency, and then Walker was helping Olivia aboard. And for the first time in what felt like an entire lifetime, she found herself surrounded by people who weren't trying to kill her, weren't hunting her, weren't dragging her toward some uncertain fate at the end of a bound rope. But the enemy commander wasn't finished. Through the open door of the helicopter, Olivia saw him emerge onto a rise overlooking their position, rage twisting his features as he watched his prize slip away for the second time that night. He raised a weapon, not a rifle, but something worse, something that made Walker's blood run cold the instant he recognized its silhouette. "RPG," Walker shouted. "Go, go, go, get us up!" "Get!" The pilot didn't hesitate, throwing the Black Hawk into a violent climbing turn, as the rocket streaked past beneath them close enough that the helicopter shuddered from the shockwave of its passage. Close enough that for one terrible second, Olivia was certain this was the moment everything ended, after everything. After surviving so much, brought down in the final seconds by a single desperate shot. But the rocket sailed past, detonating harmlessly against the mountainside below, and the helicopter climbed away into the darkness, leaving the valley and everything in it falling behind them. Olivia sagged against the interior of the aircraft, adrenaline finally fully draining out of her system, leaving nothing behind but bone-deep exhaustion and a pain that seemed to radiate from every part of her body at once. "Hey!" Walker's voice, close now gentle in a way that surprised her, given everything she'd heard of his command voice over the radio. "Hey, stay with me, Sergeant. You did it. You're safe now." "Marcus," she managed, turning her head toward where Ramirez was working over her spotter with focused intensity. "He's stable," Ramirez called over the rotor noise. "Bleeding's controlled pulse is improving. He's tough, this one. He's going to make it." Something in Olivia's chest wound so tight for so many hours she'd nearly forgotten what it felt like to relax, finally, mercifully released. "Thank you," she whispered, and wasn't entirely sure who she was thanking anymore. Walker, the pilot god Marcus for hanging on, or simply the strange, impossible fact that after everything, after all of it, they had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, survived. "No," Walker said, shaking his head, his voice thick with an emotion he made no effort to hide. "Sergeant Hayes, you don't thank us. We're the ones who owe you everything. My whole team is alive because of what you did tonight. Sullivan's in surgery right now instead of a body bag because you put 2 rounds into a machine gun crew you had no orders to engage. You saved every single one of us, and you did it completely alone." Olivia closed her eyes, feeling the helicopter's steady vibration beneath her. Feeling for the first time in hours something that resembled safety rather than just the absence of immediate death. "I wasn't going to watch you die," she said simply. "Any of you. That was never going to be an option I could live with." Walker studied her for a long moment, something profound and unspoken passing across his weathered face. "Well," he said finally, "you didn't have to live with it. Because of you, none of us had to find out what that would have felt like." The flight back to base passed in a blur for Olivia, exhaustion and blood loss finally claiming the last of her conscious resistance, and she drifted in and out of awareness as medics met the helicopter on the tarmac, as hands lifted her onto a stretcher. As familiar and unfamiliar voices called out vitals and instructions in the particular urgent shorthand of people trying to save a life. She surfaced fully briefly as they wheeled her toward the medical bay, catching a glimpse of Walker walking alongside her stretcher, his hand resting briefly steadying on her shoulder. "You're home," he told her. "You made it. Both of you made it." And somewhere behind him, through the haze of exhaustion and relief flooding through her, Olivia caught sight of a young man standing at the edge of the flight line, the local civilian she'd saved hours earlier. The one whose life had been the reason she'd broken every rule of engagement in the first place. Watching with tears streaming openly down his face as the woman who'd refused to let him die was finally safely brought home herself. "Everyone made it," she whispered, before the darkness finally gently pulled her under. She surfaced in a hospital bed 3 hours later to the steady beep of a heart monitor and the particular sterile hush of a medical bay in the deep hours before dawn, and for a moment disoriented, she reached instinctively for a rifle that wasn't there. Easy. A hand caught hers, gentle but firm. You're safe, Sergeant. You're at Bagram. You've been out for a while. Olivia blinked against the fluorescent light until the face above her resolved into focus. A nurse, kind-eyed, exhausted, in the way everyone on this base seemed to be exhausted tonight. Marcus. Olivia rasped the name tearing out of her before anything else could form. Where's Marcus, is he? Stable, the nurse said quickly. Out of surgery, resting 2 rooms down. He's going to make a full recovery, though it'll take time. You saved his life, Sergeant. Twice over, from what I've heard. Olivia let her head fall back against the pillow, relief washing through her so completely it left her trembling. Can I see him? Not tonight. You need rest, and frankly, so does he. Tomorrow. The nurse checked the IV line taped to Olivia's arm, adjusted something on the monitor, and offered a small, tired smile. There's someone who's been waiting outside for almost an hour, refusing to leave. Says he won't take up much of your time. Olivia didn't need to ask who. She nodded, and a moment later, Lieutenant Commander Ethan Walker stepped through the doorway, still in the same dirt-streaked uniform from hours earlier, looking like a man who'd aged a decade in a single night, and hadn't slept a minute of it. You look terrible, Olivia said, her voice hoarse, but carrying the faint ghost of humor. Walker huffed out something between a laugh and an exhale. You should see yourself. I have a feeling I don't want to. He pulled a chair beside her bed and sat, elbows on his knees, studying her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, certainly, but something heavier beneath it. Something that looked almost like disbelief, that she was real, that any of tonight had actually happened the way it had. I owe you my life, he said simply, without preamble. Not in the way people usually say that. I mean it literally. Sullivan's alive. Coleman's alive. My whole team walked off that mountain because of choices you made that nobody ordered you to make. I had orders, Olivia said. Observe, report. I broke every one of them. Good, Walker said without hesitation. Because if you'd followed them, we'd all be dead, and you'd have a clean conscience about it. I don't think that trade would have been worth it. I don't think you think so either. Olivia looked away toward the window, where the first gray hints of dawn were beginning to soften the darkness outside. There's going to be an investigation, she said quietly. Isn't there? I fired on a target I wasn't cleared to engage. I abandoned an overwatch position. I used a stolen enemy radio to communicate on unsecured frequencies. There's a list, Commander, and it's not short. Walker leaned forward. There's already been a preliminary review, he said. I made sure of that the second I got off that helicopter. And for what it's worth, every single officer who's looked at what happened tonight is asking the same question I am. Which is, why isn't this woman already wearing a medal? Olivia let out a breath that was half laugh, half disbelief. Command doesn't usually see it that way when someone breaks protocol. Command, Walker said, usually isn't looking at 8 men who are alive specifically because someone broke protocol in exactly the right way, at exactly the right moment, for exactly the right reasons. I've written statements. My whole team has written statements. Colonel Reyes personally authorized your rescue extraction based on nothing but your name and a scrap of radio contact. That's not the action of a command structure preparing to bury you in paperwork, Sergeant. That's the action of people who already understand what you did out there. Olivia wanted to believe him. Some small, exhausted, battered part of her did believe him, but 3 deployments and a career spent proving herself twice as hard as her male counterparts had taught her not to trust reassurances that hadn't yet been tested against the machinery of military bureaucracy. She didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 days later, showered, stitched her arm in a sling, and her leg wrapped tight enough that walking still sent sharp reminders shooting up through her calf. Olivia sat across a folding table from a review board of 3 officers she'd never met, in a room that smelled faintly of stale coffee and old carpet, and felt every instinct in her body brace for the fight she'd been expecting since the moment she woke up in that hospital bed. The senior officer, a colonel named Whitfield with silver at his temples and an expression carved from granite, opened a folder in front of him and studied it for a long moment before looking up. "Staff Sergeant Hayes," he said, "walk us through your decision-making process the moment you observed the initial ambush forming." Olivia straightened in her chair, forcing steel into a spine that wanted more than anything to simply collapse from exhaustion. "Sir, I observed enemy forces moving into positions inconsistent with the briefed intelligence. I attempted to warn the ground element via radio. That transmission was not received due to equipment damage sustained shortly afterward." "And when your spotter was wounded, leaving you alone at the overwatch position?" "I continued observation, sir, as trained." "Until you didn't," Whitfield said, not unkindly but pointedly. Olivia held his gaze. "Until an enemy combatant placed a weapon against the head of an unarmed civilian hostage in full view of my scope, sir, with clear intent to execute him in front of the pinned American element. At that point, I made the determination that continued observation without action would result in an unnecessary loss of life that I had the capability to prevent." "You weren't authorized to engage." "No, sir, I wasn't." "You engaged anyway." "I did, sir." The second officer, a woman with sharp eyes and a notepad she'd been filling steadily throughout the exchange, leaned forward slightly. "Sergeant, I want to be direct with you. Some of what's in this file reads like a soldier who decided her own judgment superseded the chain of commands. That's a serious concern, regardless of outcome." Olivia felt heat rise in her chest. Not quite anger, something closer to a fierce, exhausted honesty that had burned away every impulse toward diplomatic hedging somewhere on that mountainside. "Ma'am, respectfully, the chain of command wasn't there. I was. The intelligence that put 8 men into that valley was wrong, and by the time anyone above me understood how wrong, 3 of those men were already wounded, and the rest were minutes from being overrun. I don't regret the decisions I made that night. I would make every one of them again in the same order without hesitation, because the alternative was watching people die when I had the power to stop it." Silence settled over the room, heavy and considering. Whitfield studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his carefully neutral expression. "You do understand," he said finally, "that soldiers who make unilateral decisions in combat, even when those decisions produce good outcomes, set a precedent that commands find difficult to institutionalize. We can't build doctrine around 'it worked out this time.'" "No, sir," Olivia agreed. "You can't. But I'd ask the board to consider that doctrine exists to serve outcomes like the one we got tonight, 8 American operators coming home alive, not the other way around. If following doctrine to the letter would have meant watching them die, then something in that doctrine failed before I ever pulled a trigger." The third officer, who'd said nothing throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke, his voice quiet, but carrying real weight in the room. "Colonel Whitfield, before we continue, I'd like to enter something into record." He slid a folder across the table. "Sworn statements, Lieutenant Commander Walker, and all 6 surviving members of his element. Every one of them independently corroborates that Sergeant Hayes' actions directly resulted in the survival of the entire team, including 2 critically wounded soldiers, who would not have survived transport without the window she created." Whitfield accepted the folder, flipping through it, with the same careful, unhurried attention he'd given everything else in this room. Olivia watched him read, watched the almost imperceptible shift in his posture, as page after page of testimony painted a picture that no amount of doctrine-focused skepticism could fully dismiss. "There's something else in here," the third officer added, "that I think the board should weigh carefully. Sergeant Hayes was captured during this engagement, held by hostile forces. She escaped unarmed, using nothing but a combat knife in her bare hands, and made her way back to a critically wounded teammate she refused to leave behind twice, in fact, once when ordered to prioritize her own extraction, and again after her escape when she could have made straight for friendly lines, and chose instead to return for him." Whitfield closed the folder slowly. He looked at Olivia for a long moment, and something in his expression granite as it was softened just slightly. "Sergeant Hayes," he said, "I want you to understand something. This board's job isn't to punish good outcomes. It's to determine whether the judgment exercised was sound given the information available at the time, regardless of how things turned out. Do you understand that distinction?" Yes, sir. Good. Because having heard this testimony and having reviewed the tactical circumstances you faced, this board finds that your actions while outside standard operational protocol were both reasonable and necessary, given the extraordinary circumstances on the ground. No disciplinary action will be pursued. He paused, and something that might almost have been the beginning of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. In fact, I expect you'll be hearing considerably more from this command in the coming weeks, and not about disciplinary matters. Olivia felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight since the moment this review began finally fully release. Word of the board's decision reached Walker within the hour, and he found Olivia sitting alone on a bench outside the medical bay, staring out at the mountains beyond the base perimeter, her sling stark white against the dust-colored fatigues she'd been issued to replace the ruined ones from that night. "Heard the news," he said, settling onto the bench beside her. "No disciplinary action." Olivia confirmed, still watching the mountains, as though some part of her expected to see the shape of that night still playing out somewhere in their folds. "Colonel Whitfield practically apologized for putting me through the review at all by the end of it." "You deserve more than no disciplinary action," Walker said. "That's the floor, Sergeant, not the ceiling." She turned to look at him, curious despite herself. "What do you mean?" Walker's expression shifted into something that looked almost like mischief. A strange contrast to the exhausted gravity he'd carried through most of their conversations so far. "I mean, I've spent the last 2 days writing the most thorough valor recommendation of my career, and I had 5 other men helping me get every detail right. This isn't over, Hayes. Not by a long shot." She wanted to argue, wanted to deflect the way she always had, the old instinct to minimize her own actions rather than let anyone dwell too long on what she'd sacrificed. But something in Walker's certainty, in the sheer stubborn conviction behind his words, made the argument die in her throat before it fully formed. "I didn't do it for a medal," she said, instead quieter. "I know," Walker said. "That's exactly why you're getting one." 3 days later, Olivia was finally allowed to visit Marcus. Wheeled down a corridor she'd walked twice already, but never with permission to see the one person whose survival had mattered to her more than her own throughout that entire endless night. She found him propped up in bed, pale but alert, a ghost of his usual dry humor already returning to his eyes when he spotted her in the doorway. "There she is," he said, voice still weak but unmistakably himself. "The famous Staff Sergeant Hayes. I hear you've been busy." "Shut up," Olivia said, and the tears that had been building since the moment she saw him breathing on his own finally broke free, sliding down her face as she crossed the room and gripped his hand, careful of the IV line taped there. "You scared the hell out of me." "Takes one to know one," Marcus said, squeezing her hand as best his depleted strength allowed. "You do know you're a legend now, right? Half this base has heard some version of the story. Somebody told me you took out a rooftop machine gun crew at 400 meters in the dark. Somebody else swears you fought off an entire squad with a knife." "That one's mostly true," Olivia admitted. Marcus's eyes widened slightly. "Mostly true. Great. Wonderful. I get shot in the opening minutes and miss the entire legend being written." "You didn't miss anything," Olivia said, her voice thick. "You were the reason I kept fighting. Every time I thought about stopping, about just running, about saving myself instead, I thought about you bleeding out on that ridge, trusting me to come back. That's not nothing, Marcus. That's everything." He studied her for a long moment, and whatever joke he might have reached for next seemed to die somewhere behind his eyes, replaced by something more solemn, more grateful than words alone could easily carry. "You didn't leave me," he said finally. "Not once. Not when it would have been smarter. Not when it would have been safer. I want you to know I remember that, Liv. Even the parts I was unconscious for, somehow I remember it." Olivia laughed, wet and unsteady, and wiped at her eyes with her uninjured hand. "That's not how consciousness works, Marcus." "Sure it is," he said, the familiar dry humor returning fully now. "I'm a highly trained sniper. I remember things other people can't." 2 weeks passed in a blur of physical therapy debriefs, and the strange, disorienting process of watching a story she'd lived through in fragmented, adrenaline-blurred moments slowly assemble itself into something that other people now told back to her, with details she hadn't even known: the young local civilian's tearful gratitude, the machine gun crew's exact position relative to the SEAL's blind spot, the precise number of hostile casualties her actions that night had ultimately produced. She learned through Walker that Jake Sullivan had woken from surgery 3 days after the mission, and asked before anything else whether the sniper who'd saved his life had made it out too. She learned that Coleman had already started telling an increasingly elaborate version of the story to anyone who'd listen, one that grew a little more mythical with each retelling, until Olivia finally cornered him in the mess hall and threatened, only half-jokingly, to correct the record herself if he didn't tone it down. "Ma'am," Coleman said, entirely unrepentant. "With respect, the truth is already unbelievable enough. I'm just adding color." And she learned on a gray morning 3 weeks after the mission, standing at attention, in a formation she hadn't fully processed until the words were already being read aloud, that Colonel Whitfield's review board hadn't simply cleared her of wrongdoing. It had recommended her unanimously for the Silver Star, one of the highest honors the military could bestow for valor in combat, awarded for actions that went, in the board's own words, above and beyond the reasonable expectations of duty in defense of fellow service members, under conditions of extraordinary personal risk. Walker stood in that formation too, along with every surviving member of his team who could walk unassisted: Ramirez, Okafor, Brooks, even Coleman, arm still in a sling, but standing at rigid, proud attention. Sullivan, still recovering, watched from a wheelchair positioned at the formation's edge. Grace beside him, having flown halfway around the world the moment she learned her fiancé was alive. Her hand gripping his so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. After the ceremony, after the photographs, and the handshakes, and the strange, overwhelming press of people wanting to shake the hand of the sniper, who'd become almost overnight something like a legend within her small corner of the military world, Olivia found herself standing apart from the crowd with Walker, both of them quiet in the particular way of people who understood something the celebration around them couldn't quite capture. "You okay?" Walker asked. "I don't know how to be the person everyone's describing," Olivia admitted. "The hero. The legend. I was scared out of my mind up there, Commander, the whole time. I wasn't fearless. I was terrified every single second." "That's what makes it mean something," Walker said. "Anybody can be brave if they don't feel the fear. Real courage is being terrified and doing it anyway, because the alternative is worse than the fear itself." He paused, studying her for a moment. "You told me something that first night in the hospital about why you fired that first shot. About your father." Olivia nodded, surprised he'd remembered. "He used to tell me a weapon isn't defined by how accurately it hits. It's defined by why you choose to use it." Smart man. He was, Olivia said quietly, and something in her voice told Walker everything he needed to know about tense change without her having to explain further. They stood together in silence for a while, watching the base return to its ordinary rhythms around them: soldiers moving between buildings, a convoy preparing for departure, the mundane machinery of a war that continued regardless of any single night's extraordinary events. "What happens now?" Walker asked eventually. "For you, I mean, after this." Olivia considered the question seriously, turning it over the way she'd learned to turn over every decision since that night on the mountain, carefully, deliberately weighing what mattered against what merely felt urgent. "I go back to work," she said finally. "There are other missions, other teams that'll need Overwatch. I don't think what happened up there changes what I do next. It just changes how I understand why I do it." And Marcus? Recovering. Slowly. He'll be back in the field eventually, though the doctors are fighting him on the timeline pretty hard. She allowed herself a small smile. "He's already trying to negotiate an earlier return date. Says he's got a reputation to maintain, now being the guy who almost died and lived to complain about missing the best part of the story." Walker laughed, and something in the sound carried the particular warmth of two people who had, through fire and blood and the longest night either of them had ever survived, become something more than strangers, something closer to family in the way only shared survival could forge. "For what it's worth," he said, "my team wants you to know something. All of them, but especially Sullivan, once he's steady enough to say it himself properly. You didn't just save our lives that night. You changed how we think about what a soldier's supposed to be." Nobody expected the person who turned that entire battle around to be a sniper nobody had ever heard of, working alone, breaking every rule in the book, because the rules weren't built for a night like that one. Olivia looked out toward the mountains one more time. The same mountains that had held her captive and nearly claimed her life and somehow impossibly given her back to the world instead. "People ask me sometimes," she said slowly, "how I made those shots. The distance, the wind, the darkness they want, the technical answer, the training, the calculations. And I can give them that answer. It's not wrong. But it's not the real answer either." "What's the real answer?" "The shot was never the hardest part," Olivia said, and the words came out steady, certain the truth she'd carried down off that mountain and would carry for the rest of her life. "The hardest part was deciding to take it. Pulling a trigger when nobody's ordered you to, when everything you've been trained to do says wait. Observe, stay hidden, and choosing instead to be seen, to be found, to become a target. Because somewhere below you, people are about to die if you don't. That decision is the hard part. The shot itself is just physics." Walker was quiet for a long moment, something profound settling behind his eyes. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," he said finally, echoing something she'd told him weeks earlier, giving it back to her transformed by everything that had happened since. "It's choosing what matters more than the fear." "Exactly," Olivia said. Months later, long after the ceremonies had ended and the story of that impossible night had settled into something closer to legend than memory within the small, tight-knit world of soldiers who'd lived through it, Ethan Walker found himself standing in front of a room full of new recruits, tasked with the particular responsibility of teaching young soldiers what courage under fire actually looked like in practice rather than theory. He told them about a mission gone wrong, about 8 men trapped and outnumbered, about a sniper nobody had properly briefed them on working alone against overwhelming odds because she refused to accept that the mission's failure meant everyone had to die alongside it. He didn't tell the story because Olivia Hayes was the greatest marksman he'd ever served alongside, though she might well have been. He told it because she'd shown an entire team of hardened operators in the space of a single impossible night what it truly meant to put someone else's survival above your own, not as an abstract ideal recited in training manuals, but as a series of concrete, terrifying, costly choices made again and again, hour after hour until dawn, finally broke over a valley that 8 men had somehow impossibly walked out of alive. A true warrior, Walker told the recruits, isn't the person who never falls. It's the person who refuses to let others fall alone. And whenever anyone asked him afterward if he truly believed one person alone, hidden in the darkness, could change the outcome of an entire battle against impossible odds, Walker gave them the same answer every time, without hesitation, without doubt. Yes, because he had been there. He had heard that first impossible rifle shot crack across the valley in the darkest hour of the night. He had watched a woman nobody had ever properly trained him to expect turn the tide of a battle that should have ended in 8 American deaths, using nothing but skill, courage, and an unshakable refusal to let good people die when she had the power to stop it. And he knew with a certainty that would stay with him for the rest of his career, for the rest of his life, that some nights, some battles, some impossible moments came down to exactly one truth that no training manual could ever fully capture. Sometimes an entire team survives because one person standing alone in the darkness makes a single unshakable decision. Nobody gets left behind.